Yo, what's up? Nice to see you again, and today we're talking about settings for the GoPro Hero 9, and this video will have two parts. I will first go through all the settings on the GoPro here, and most of the settings are actually the same to the Hero 8 and 7, but there's one change that I will mention in between, and then in the second part of this video I will go through my profiles and how I set them up and why, like for what I use them. So let's get started. So, settings that I used on the Hero 9 but also previous GoPro cameras. So I'm actually a bit lazy, so let's just look on the screen here. First, resolution and FPS, we will come later to that when we go through the profiles, because that actually only differences between all these profiles that I use. But then the lens, I usually have it either set to wide or linear, like I change it a little bit depending on what shot I want to get. Hyper smooth, I always have it to on, and usually also boost, like I can't have enough stabilization. It's just great to have that. Scheduled capture on the Hero 9, I have it turned to off because I usually don't schedule. Duration, I also don't want to limit my duration, like my limit is the button on top. Hindsight, I also don't use that. Like, this is really up to you, like depending on what shot you want to get, you can use that if you want to. Timer, I've also set that to off. Zoom 1, I would never change the zoom on the GoPro because that just crops in artificially and you don't want that. So it essentially lowers the quality of your footage, and that's why you should not use the zoom feature at all. Always have it to 1.0. Pro Tune, definitely turn Pro Tune on. And then the bitrate, I've set it to high because high bitrate means that the files are a little bit bigger, so some of you might not like that, but it's not that these files are huge, but therefore it captures more information, which is good for color grading, but also when you get action shots, maybe you do some BMX or snowboarding or whatever, then with this fast motion it can capture more detail and therefore the images or the videos look better. Then shutter, I've set the shutter to automatic. If you use ND filters with the Hero 9 or whatever GoPro you use, then you should set the shutter to 150s or 120s or 100s of a second, depending on your frame rate, because the shutter speed should usually be twice the frame rate, and you use ND filters to achieve that, because if you would do that without an ND filter, then your image would get too bright. But the way how I use GoPros is that I just have it in my pocket, and whenever I need a quick shot, I just take it out of my pocket and I get the shot, and therefore I want to have automatic exposure. I don't want to have a fixed shutter there, because then maybe I would have to take off the ND filter and change it and so on, and then I might miss my shot. So the way how I use my GoPro cameras don't really allow to use ND filters and this shutter rule, etc. So that's why I keep the shutter to automatic. EV compensation, very important. I have it set to -0.5, but under some conditions I actually set it to -1 or -2 sometimes even, because what that does is it makes your image a bit darker or brighter. And usually I want to have the image a little bit more dark because that protects details in the highlights. So for example, when you're outside, then you can see clouds in the sky, but at the same time you can also see a bit of detail still in the shadows. So -0.5 is usually a pretty good value here on all GoPro cameras, because then the shadows are still not too dark, but it gives you a little bit more detail in the highlights. But if you are under conditions, maybe a sunset or so on, where you want to mostly get detail in the sky but not in the shadow areas where they're not that important, then it's totally fine to set that to up to -2. So white balance is one setting that many people hate, but it's definitely good to set that not to auto but to a certain value, and that's usually 5,500 for daylight and 6,500 for cloudy days, especially if you have overcast. If you really have a lot of change in the sky, let's say you have particularly cloudy days where it's like 5 minutes sunny, 5 minutes cloudy, then you can also set it to automatic, because that saves you a bit of time in post. But it is a bit harder if you do a lot of color grading, because then one shot looks a bit different than the other, and it's harder to compensate for that then. So that's actually why I usually don't use automatic white balance. I prefer setting the value manually, because that makes it a bit easier for me in post to color grade the videos. But yeah, if you don't use color grading at all, or you don't care much about it, even if you do a little bit of color grading, then automatic white balance can work. It's just not recommended. ISO min 100, don't do anything else here. ISO max, I have it set to 400 and I would not set it higher because even at ISO 800 it introduces so much noise that the footage is barely usable. So I really keep it at 400 and I always hope that it doesn't get to that level because with this small sensor you just get more noise usually. Sharpness settings. So on previous generations it was usually good to set it to medium, but on the Hero 9, because it has more megapixels, it's actually better to set it to low because otherwise it would look too sharp. Like, you don't want to have this digital sharpness in your videos. You want to have it look natural, and you get that more on this camera when you set it to low. Color, always set it to flat because that gives you more dynamic range, but therefore, as the name says, the image becomes a bit flatter, so it's not as contrasty and saturated as it would usually be, and therefore you would have to do a bit of color grading in post. But it's not bad, it's actually quite easy. You just add a bit of contrast and saturation back, and you do your normal color grades, and then it looks good. But therefore you get more dynamic range, and the image overall looks a bit more pleasing. Then it also gives you more flexibility in post for color grading. Raw audio, I've set it to off because usually audio sounds good enough for me. Wind also off because I don't want to have this wind suppression in the camera because that makes the audio basically unusable. It actually oftentimes sounds better if you have a bit of wind noise in there than suppressing it because it takes out the bass and then your audio looks like a robot. It's really not pleasing. So yeah, just keep it off. And then shortcuts. Shortcuts, you had that already on the Hero 8 as well. So these are just some icons on the display with settings that you use often. And the lower left, I've set it to lens because I oftentimes want to switch quickly between wide and ultra wide and linear. So that's great for that. Then on the lower right, I've set the white balance because especially if I'm on days where it changes a lot, then I would have to change that quickly. Upper left, I've set EV compensation. So as mentioned before, there I can make some quick adjustments depending on my lighting conditions. And on the upper right, I have hyper smooth. I don't really use that hyper smooth there. I just set it up once, but you can do whatever you want there. Generally, this settings, if there are some other settings that you think you would use more often, then just set it there in this shortcuts menu, so you're quite flexible here. It's just, I think generally the settings that most of you guys will need a lot is white balance and EV compensation, because that is something that changes all the time and therefore you have to make quick changes. So having that two settings on the main screen is definitely a big advantage. So, but these are not the only settings. There are also a few more settings when you swipe from the top to the bottom and then from the left to right and you click on preferences. There you have general, and under general you will find a point which is called video compression, and there it really depends a bit on the computer you have and what you edit on, because there you can switch between H.264 and HEVC. So in some resolutions and frame rates it always uses HEVC. So if you have an older computer that doesn't handle HEVC, that will always be a problem for you. If you shoot, for example, in 4K 60 FPS, that's always HEVC, so that's problematic then. But if you don't use it, if you shoot mostly in 1080 or so on, then you can use the H.264 option, which I think is standard, and that makes it a bit easier for you to edit the video. But my recommended setting here is to set it to HEVC only, because HEVC gives you more compression, and that means that it saves more details and more data in the same file without actually increasing the file size. And this is great because it increases the quality of your video. So I personally have it always set to HEVC, but as mentioned, it can be a bit problematic if you have an older computer. Okay, so much about the general settings. I would say let's talk about the presets that I use. And the first preset here is a standard one, which I've set to 5K 24 FPS. You don't need to use 24 FPS. It's totally fine to use 25 or 30 FPS. It's really up to you, depending on if you're in Europe or the US, and if you like 24 FPS more, 30 FPS. So it's really up to you here. But the main thing here in this profile is that I shoot in 5K. And I use this profile most of the time, for example, for landscape shots where I want to have a lot of resolution, a lot of detail, fine detail, because 5K, a higher resolution, helps with that. But also when I want to get shots of myself, maybe I want to film myself hiking, for example, then I oftentimes want to add a bit of animation in post by cropping in and then animate the position of the frame. So that gives the impression of like someone else would film me, and it also makes a shot more interesting. But the problem with that is that you essentially throw away pixels, so you lose detail. So the more you crop in, the more detail and quality you lose. And by having a higher resolution, it means that you can actually crop in more without losing so much quality. So if I publish my video in 4K and I shoot in 5K, I can actually crop in to about 125% without actually losing any resolution or quality there, which is great. And I can actually even crop in a bit more without that people would notice that. So oftentimes actually when I shoot in 5K, I crop in up to 150%. It's not really an issue here. The next profile that I have is activity, and this is what I've set to 4K with 60 FPS. So this is actually the profile that I use the most because that allows me to slow the footage down to up to 40% when I edit in 24p. Oftentimes this is actually good because then the footage looks even smoother and a bit dreamy. So that's a good enhancement for my video. So 4K 60 FPS, usually the one that I use the most. Then there's a cinematic profile, 4K 24 Super View. To be honest, I don't really use it for like cinematics or so on. I mostly use it for when I'm on my motorbike, because on my motorbike I usually don't really want to slow down the footage. I really want to show the speed. So 24 FPS works perfectly there. Again, you can also use 25 or 30 FPS. It's up to you. But the most important feature that I use there is super view, so it gets the like biggest, widest angle on this camera, and it's just great on the motorbike because then you can see my motorbike and you can also see the road. So it allows for a nice view. And the last preset that I have here is Slo-Mo, where I've set it to 2.7K resolution and 120 FPS. And it's basically the same as the 4K 60 preset, just that I have a bit less resolution, but therefore I have a higher frame rate, so I can slow it down even more. Like 120 FPS means that I can slow it down to 20% of the original speed, and I can actually also even set it to only 10% by activating optical flow in Final Cut, so that basically calculates frames in between, and therefore I have a really smooth, very slow motion, and it's just a very nice and dreamy look. So it's just when I want to have a super slow motion, then I use that. And to be honest, 2.7K still looks really good on that camera. I would not really crop in that footage anymore, but if I upscale this 2.7K to 4K in my timeline, it's totally fine. I get good results with it. So this is absolutely usable here, and 120 FPS is great for awesome slow motions. So these are the profiles that I use, but that doesn't necessarily mean that these are also the right profiles for you. I shoot mostly travel content or content when I'm outside generally and I want to get a quick shot. So if you shoot different videos, maybe some sports stuff or so on, then it could definitely be that other profiles and different settings work a bit better for you. But if you like the content that you see on my channel, then I would definitely suggest you to also have a look at my cinematic GoPro video masterclass. There I really teach you everything about GoPro cameras that you need to know to produce cinematic videos with that. I will leave a link to that in the description below, so if that sounds interesting, check it out. And also, if you enjoyed this video, leave me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for upcoming videos. See ya!